Turning to structuring the program, even before getting into all the program details, we did just want to mention, and we'll come back to this, that building an electric vehicles program is a conscious choice. So this guidebook that we're referring to, and kind of our general stance from doing this work, is that local governments and their partners should pick clean energy technologies that best align with their community's needs and with their goals and commercially available options. So here, for the sake of providing a targeted webinar to you all, we've obviously honed in on electric vehicles, but you'll notice that a lot of the points and questions that we raise really focus on unpacking what the community's goals are, which may direct a city to a technology solution other than electric vehicles, and we'll come back to that point. So turning to the context, a couple of points on the context. First, talking about costs, upfront costs of electric vehicles can be greater than conventional vehicles. This gap is shrinking. Electric vehicles are likely to be less costly to operate and maintain. I think some studies have shown that running an electric vehicle costs less than half as much to operate a gas-powered vehicle. Obviously, that depends on gas and electric rates locally and the type of car driven, but that's just some framing there. And then in terms of city level and beyond, it really is important to think about the infrastructure and what that requires of cities, so such as public charging stations being a pretty key contextual factor in ensuring that electric vehicles can be utilized and that they're accessible to all parts of the communities you want to serve. I'd say taking a targeted universalist approach to equitable electric vehicle program design, a city might consider stationing public charging stations at or near affordable housing residences, for example, or other key areas of the community that the targeted group tends to frequent, just as a flavor again. On the next slide, looking at economic impacts and potential other types of impacts. In terms of job creation, this tends to be one where in the clean energy community we can sometimes take for granted that job creation is always a good thing, and that can, on average, arguably be true. But one thing we really want to think about in equitable program design is how electric vehicle investment can have both positive and negative implications in the immediate term for job opportunities and job training, right? So there might be more or less of certain types of jobs as electric vehicle adoption grows. It's not just that net jobs, but really what the breakdown is among, say, electricians versus auto mechanics, for example, who might come from different sorts of demographic backgrounds. And we'll come back to a lot of these concepts in the examples. On the front around impacts for low-income communities of color, just again for a flavor, target communities might be disproportionately exposed to things like tailpipe emissions from traffic. And so the air quality and health benefits of electric vehicles can have a potentially disproportionate impact in low and moderate income communities of color, particularly in the cases of medium and heavy duty vehicles. So bearing all that context in mind, there are 5 key components on the next slide to establishing program structure. So these are outlined here. We will talk through each of them in a bit more detail. So refining sustainability and equity goals, considering the contextual factors, some of which we just touched on, defining program eligibility, determining a program administrator, and then recruiting key partners. On refining sustainability and equity goals, there's really, it might seem obvious, but being clear about what your equity goals are is a pretty critical step to ensuring you can actually achieve that goal, and then being aware of the context that you're operating in is also really critical to ensuring that you can meet the needs of the underserved communities where you are. So circling back to what we touched on, now that we're talking more explicitly about goals, on that thought that local governments and their partners can design electric vehicle programs in a way that aligns technology with the community needs, we can observe that in addition to electric vehicles, there's other types of electric transportation that might better serve a given community depending on its goals, right? So I wanted to give you an example here. If air quality centers in the community's equity focus, then perhaps light-duty electric vehicles would not be the first solution, since light-duty vehicles don't tend to contribute as heavily to air pollution. So I want to give you a flavor of that, and then we will unpack some of these other factors around context, utility, geographic, economic in a moment here. On defining the goals, one thing to think about is, what do you mean by equity? So in terms of equity, there are a couple different ways to sort of think about this. One is just, how has the city defined equity in the past? Is there an existing municipal equity policy lens that the program can build off of or build towards? And if not, can you look for similar concepts in other city policies or strategies around equity, human rights, social justice, or poverty reduction, right? So there are places to start. It's best for a number of reasons not to feel like you're starting from scratch there. And then what the program goals are, really how are equity and sustainability, again, already defined in existing documents or existing plans, city council strategic plan priorities, et cetera, climate plans, poverty reduction plans. There's a lot of options there. And thinking about how program goals can align with the established goals of intended beneficiaries, right? So in getting people on board for these, what is it that the community is already excited about? Is it extending the reach of public transit, increasing access to personal vehicles? Like, if these are already articulated somewhere, particularly by underserved communities, that's really something to latch onto and really build on, and allows communities to feel like you're actually listening to them already. So finally, how would a program contribute to a vision of a more equitable future? This is, again, thinking about both short and long term, right? So are you thinking of establishing a pilot program? Is this the beginning of a longer program? And then finally, throughout, we have a whole other section on the guidebook that we're not focusing on today, but when you're thinking of defining goals or refining goals, being really mindful of structural barriers to participation, right? So whose voices are even being heard and who's even in the conversation for defining these goals, and ensuring that where and when these types of conversations are being held are as accessible as possible. So that's around defining the goals. As we turn to thinking about context, there's a couple of factors that we have here: geographic, economic, and policy, and then utility. So in terms of geographic, what is some of the questions, and I should have said on the last slide, actually, I won't talk through each of these questions, but really the questions that are on these slides sort of are laid out this way around each of the key steps. These questions are all here for your reference and will be here, as well as in related resources that Api and Allison will sort of make available to everyone following the call. So coming back to geographic context, things like, what is the urban-rural composition? What is the composition of the housing stock? What neighborhoods have the longest commutes? What's the existing EV infrastructure look like? These are all important to consider, because you might, for example, think about in your own context how that can come to fruition. So an EV car sharing program designed for a rural or less dense community would look very different from an urban EV car sharing program, for example. On economic and policy context, this is really thinking about for whom electric vehicles are most and least viable. As you think about, most adopters so far of electric vehicles to date have largely been single-family households. So thinking about how to incorporate multi-unit residential buildings and the types of additional challenges that there might be there in terms of mixed incentives between tenants and landlords. And then thinking about at a broader economic policy level, right, as the city and regional economic development agendas are probably pursuing further economic development in many instances, that can have strong implications for long-term access to EV infrastructure. If an area of a city gentrifies, that can result in relocation of target populations and really be shifting who is then served by the EV infrastructure that might be put in. Finally, on utility regulatory context, a couple of points here, noting that maybe there might be a little bit more of a US-based framework here, but I think it does have some relevance. So thinking about the type of utility that it's served, so in the US, big considerations are around whether the utility has the authority to rate-base EV charging, as an example, right? And the types of flexibility that could be offered to pursue that or other ends. A municipal utility in the US tends to have more flexibility in these regards, versus on the investor-owned and regulated regulated utility side, the types of things to think about include what have public utility commissions done or ordered related to equity. So in California, for instance, where there are relatively a lot of electric vehicle programs approved, there's actually a requirement in many cases that a level of investment is made in the program that is targeted towards low-income areas. And so these are, again, all important contextual factors to be aware of in designing your program. In terms of defining program eligibility, on the next slide, there's, again, a few key considerations to think about. And I'd really invite us back to that concept of targeted universalism. Because program eligibility, sometimes our default is to really think about income first. It actually can be centered around a whole variety of potential other factors, some of which are outlined here, right? So it could be most restricted mobility, who has the longest commutes, highest transportation cost burden. These are all other sorts of ways of thinking about how you want to center your program. And regardless of what you choose, you really want to think about what are the key barriers, right? So some of the key barriers might be cost and financial, such as lacking a credit card or a bank account or good credit. Examples of physical access or use barriers might be that needs are different for seniors or for parents who are transporting young children or for people with disabilities. So we're just really thinking about, that you're not, by thinking about eligibility, that you're not sort of inadvertently doing anything else negative to preclude who is centered in the program. Another example is if you think about technology barriers, does the program rely on the use of a smartphone or the internet? Or does the range of an electric vehicle limit its effectiveness for people who have to commute very far? All of these types of factors might become inadvertent eligibility criteria if you're not sort of aware of those factors at the outset in the design phase. So just taking that all into account as you're thinking about defining eligibility and taking a sort of scaled or a ramped approach is really that targeted universalism approach, where you might pick a particular group first to target, but then sort of thinking in terms of concentric circles and how can you provide perhaps slightly lower levels of support to others that are still affected, but perhaps slightly less affected. And I want to give a quick moment here as we're talking about eligibility back to Api to talk about, because on the next slide there it does outline a number of key factors that you can think about here, right, in terms of income, housing, transportation, demographics, energy affordability. And so Avi, I think I will pass over to you to just briefly touch on the CUSP Energy Poverty and Equity Explorer tool to let participants really know how they can use this tool just for a moment and as they think about these questions.
Yeah, thanks, Para. And so some of you might already be familiar, but CUSP has developed an energy poverty and equity mapping tool. It's on energypoverty.ca. If you go on there, you'll find the tool and you can launch it. So the tool has for a while had income, housing, demographics, transportation indicators for from a neighborhood scale all the way to a census division scale, and comparing that and cross-tabulating that against energy affordability, which is defined as households that pay more than twice the national average on home energy cost burdens. Now, the good news is that very recently, as of like 2 weeks ago, we have added, in addition to energy affordability, we've also added transportation affordability. So we have now the way, again, with all these geographic scales, you can go on the mapping tool and look at commute mode and distance. So households that are traveling more than 25 kilometers, commuting more than 25 kilometers to work. And so now, instead of treating energy poverty and affordability and transportation poverty and affordability as almost two different silos, now you can compare across them and really think about, like when Farah was talking about here earlier about, sorry, wrong direction, eligibility, is thinking about who has the longest commutes and how are they related to households that also have high energy cost burdens and so on. I'll hand it back to you now, Farah. Can I go over to the next slide? Oh, there it is. Yeah,
Sounds
the long
perfect.
distance mode, medium distance modes. Yeah.
Sounds perfect. Thanks, Abhi. Great. So we just wanted to give you a quick preview there, but to bring us now to the next section around, as you're getting the program really kind of envisioned and then ultimately kind of structured, right? Who all do you want to be a part of the process? And so what we have here is just a few last slides from me before you can actually hear more in depth and bring these to life from some examples. These are really around program partners. And so we want to harken back to, I know that there was a previous webinar some months back that really touched more on coalition building, but we wanted to at least revisit this idea that very few clean energy programs, including electric vehicle programs, can be successful in general, let alone to be successful on the metric of all the equity metrics that we could think of without having partnerships. Right, so building successful partnerships is a key to executing successful equity-oriented electric vehicles programs. So we've outlined here just some of the types of program partners that could be involved, and they can be playing a variety of functions around financial support, bringing resources, technical assistance, community outreach, and other. And these are really the types of program partners that you want to think about engaging. So community partners, whether that's neighborhood organizations, faith-based advocacy, or other types of local and community foundations, nonprofit partners, whether that's community development organizations, community action agencies, financial, a whole range, whether that's CDFIs or other types, governments, both local, state, neighboring municipalities, right? Don't forget about opportunities to partner nearby, and then technical partnerships, right? So that could be utilities or others. I think the kind of key piece here is really thinking about, as we turn into the next slide, is that different partners can play different roles. So as you think about who could be best positioned to administer the program, you really want to think about what the key needs are from the program and how to center equity. And then from there, it'll sort of be clear, or at least clearer, who is best positioned to be a program administrator. So some of the needs, right, might be, is it siting, is it coordinating permitting, is it community outreach, logistics, user interface? Really, what's the biggest need from a participant's perspective, and then who's best positioned to do that? Centering equity, really thinking about, regardless how who is the administrator, when you're actually pursuing a partnership and thinking about formalizing it, there's ways to really include equity directly into that process, into, for example, an RFP or selection process. So a city can ask its partners a direct line of questioning around, its internal structure or its engagement. So does the organization have a diversity and inclusion policy or goals for recruitment and retainment? What sorts of equity training does the partner have? How does the partner engage with target audiences in terms of program design and execution? Are the administrators' engagement practices and processes transparent and accessible and also iterative, right? So not just stopping at what's produced the first time, but responsive to community feedback. So these are the types of considerations to really think about as you bring equity to the forefront of even making what might seem like more logistical decisions around who a program administrator is. On the next slide around city government roles, really the evaluation that we just described can actually be applied to oneself as the city government, and think about evaluating your own and your colleagues' capacity and availability and existing history around being able to deliver on the items that we just described. And if it's determined that the city government is not sort of the right organization to be in the administrator role, think about what sort of other supporting roles a city government can play. So we have some of those listed here. It might be providing space for charging infrastructure. It might be, and I guess coming back to our equity focus, right, it might be particularly if there's opportunity for government-controlled siting near where target demographics might be located, such as affordable housing locations, but could be others. Program outreach can also be a nice opportunity to integrate with local government, particularly if you have existing programs from a housing sector or other sectors. Of course, you have to mind confidentiality, but are there ways to sort of leverage program outreach possibilities? And then similarly, providing other sorts of data and input depending on the specific program type. So I think these are what you want to consider internally for yourself as a city government. And then finally, in terms of recruiting key partners, on the last slide, we have listed a few of the core competencies that, again, may be somewhat held in-house at the local government, but may be areas you want to supplement on, right? So community engagement, there might be partners that really have the experience and knowledge to facilitate the equitable program design on the ground, whether that's through language services, educational materials or outreach, or existing relationships. Technical assistance, there might be particular electric vehicles, charging equipment, logistical support, legal protection types of considerations that are just best provided through another partner. And then finally, there might be other partners that can provide certain types of financial support or resources. And so I'll just conclude with a very quick example, again, without getting into the details, but Cully Car Share in Portland, Oregon is an example in which an electric vehicle advocacy nonprofit called Forth partnered with an affordable housing nonprofit called Hacienda Community Development Corporation, and that CDC actually owned and managed residential buildings in a particular area and was able to play that outreach and supportive services role. And then they also, that duo had yet another partner that was more focused on providing the actual car sharing app. So again, that's just an example of bringing together different types of expertise to really center equity in delivering an equitable program, like thinking about what is actually needed and what roles each partner can play to make a successful and equitable program. So with that, that's kind of all the key concepts we wanted to walk through. I'm sure that a lot of this will come to life a bit more in the examples that my colleague Philip will provide here momentarily. But I did just want to take a very quick pause and see, are there any burning conceptual questions? And otherwise, I'm sure that it will be a bit clearer as we get into the examples. So any quick burning conceptual questions here?
Yeah, Farah, just a couple of quick notes as we jump into questions. So I think we can take a 5 to 10 minute pause here, not necessarily a quick one, just to bubble some questions up. And the second note is I wanted to clarify something I had said earlier regarding transportation data. So what we do have there are indicators. So we've calculated distance and mode. What we don't have yet is we don't have a metric for transportation poverty, so to speak. So we have some metrics on there that you can compare against energy poverty, but we're working on adding more transportation-related affordability costs and burdens. So any questions from the audience, you can either vocalize it or type it in the chat if you so please, and we'll take about 5 or 10 minutes to take questions.
Hi there, this is Max from the city of Surrey. Can folks hear me?
Yes, Max.
Great. So just on Abhi's last comment there, I'm just wondering if Farah, or I'm sorry, I forgot the name of your colleague, if you know of any data out there, or even how we could try to understand transportation costs when we're thinking about that burden and its impact on equity, because we imagine here that it's likely higher than a lot of our home energy costs. And so we really want to try to consider that as we're moving forward with our strategy.
Sure, I can jump in and talk about that a little bit. This is Philip Krajcik, Farah's colleague at CADMIS, and I would say that Abhi is right on the right track when he's thinking about this. I think that the real important thing is to look at the combined burden of transportation and housing cost burdens, because there's a lot intertwined there. People tend to move further away from core cities because they may be priced out from the upfront costs of home ownership or from the price of rent, and so they may or may not be fully aware of the amount of trade-off they're having when they add transportation costs to the mix, and thinking about that not only in terms of the actual costs, but also the opportunity costs, lost time, and all those sorts of things. But in terms of actual data, I'd say that I have more familiarity of data sources in the US, and I could ask around with some colleagues to see if they have any data sources in Canada. But in the US, we have this National Household Transportation Survey that provides some pretty good information that really digs in deeply with groups in sort of each metro area. And there's obviously a whole bunch of census transportation planning package sort of material as well that helps you get at how many vehicle miles traveled people have to. And so even if you don't have that, if you don't have the direct cost data, you could sort of look at VMT data and think about look at vehicle registrations, what sort of fuel efficiency they have, and sort of back into some conclusions about costs. But I couldn't say whether you could get direct data or if you would need to back into it without digging in a little more. Does that help?
Max, this is Allison here. Max, if I can just add to what we're doing here for 2020, CUSP's data gap to be attacked is the transportation data gap, and so we've started with adding what we can from the census to the Explorer tool, which you can see right now just includes commute mode and distance, and we have a lot of different indicators within that which aren't yet on the tool. So within the next couple of weeks, you'll see a lot more metrics there. Right now, I think all we show are the percentage of households with really large commutes, more than 25 kilometers one way to work. And then also what the median commute is for a particular census tract. We have a lot more by specifically distance by specific mode, et cetera, that will all be getting up there in the next couple of weeks. That doesn't obviously tie to cost, and I will say that the first limitation, obviously, to that census data, which is all we've got available, is that it's commute to work only. So it does not include pleasure trips. It doesn't include commute to school. It even doesn't include people who commute to different places every day. So it's only if you're commuting to a regular location. To make it further conservative, it includes as the crow flies, not as you drive. So it's point to point, a straight line. So obviously it also understates the true distance of travel. But we're using it because it's what we've got, and presumably also commute to work is one of the areas where, you know, that's the most repetitive travel that somebody does. So it should be the easiest way for us to get them into other modes of transportation away from their private vehicle, and also to figure out why it is that people are needing to drive so far by private vehicle and what gaps there might be in transit connectivity and frequency. So we are going to work on the cost stuff. We can begin to, now that we have some commute distances, we can begin to impute some costs by adding fuel costs by province to start to imply what that transportation energy cost will be. But we would like to be looking more holistically at housing and transportation affordability. So recognizing that energy cost is one aspect of car ownership, the rest being maintenance and the actual cost of owning the car being far greater. We want to be looking kind of more holistically at transportation affordability and the cost of car ownership, in addition to sort of the energy cost burdens that are added to the total energy poverty that a household might be experiencing with their home energy bills, and then further amplified by their costs of transportation energy as well. So we are working on it, but you know, the National Household Survey is far too insufficient in terms of its size of 15,000 households across the country to really give us very good transportation cost data. So we're gonna do our best to impute some cost data. We're gonna do our best to get some Google trip data from smartphones that they've been using for their Environmental Insights Explorer. And we're working with Transportation Canada to also see what more they have. So it's on our radar for this year, and we will do our best. But for now, we're going to have to kind of do some workarounds with this commute stuff and imputing some costs.
Allison, sorry, this is Eric from Non-City Calgary. I was just going to say it might be worth touching base to some of the municipalities, because I know like we collect a lot of that type of data for doing our regional transportation modeling and have like a continuous household activity survey going on. So a lot of the larger cities might have some good data that you could leverage. And just in terms of the fuel costs, I know one of the discoveries we had out of our data is that although the commute's probably the longest, most consistent trip, it still only accounts for about 25% of the travel activity people ever do on a day. So there's a lot of the non-commute activity making up a big part of what people are up to.
Absolutely true. Yeah.
This is Abhi jumping in. I wanted to add to that and say, on my part, I'm on the lookout for case studies of what cities in Canada have done to address some of these gaps, Max. So if there's ways that they have complemented, or fill in the gaps, doing some sort of sampling, surveying methodology locally. I haven't found many yet, but I'm on the lookout for that to address exactly the kind of gaps you're looking to fill. So as soon as I find out, I'll send it to you, Max, and then also to the broader group that it might be useful.
This is Glenys from Saanich. And I do know that the Capital Regional District, the CRD, is working on looking at the bundling affordability of housing and transportation. And sometimes it makes sense to try to put in some childcare costs into there as well to get a fuller picture for some types of families. So anyway, that's a resource that's going to be coming out soon. And informally, I've also been hearing from the community just some interesting points about equity that are not in this data, but about ability to choose other modes being limited for lower income people. So for instance, if you are working shift work and your shift ends or starts before bus service is available, or if you are somebody who needs to drive, like if you're doing one of the food delivery services, for instance, all of these things make it harder than commuting to work where you've got a government job with showers and a regular schedule and the buses run at peak times when you need to get places. So I thought that was some interesting other considerations too.
Thank you. Any other quick questions? Again, I should have mentioned this earlier, but as I'll flip it over to Philip to take us forward on the programmatic examples. But if you have questions, just type them in the chat, either to me or to the whole group, and we'll revisit them at the end of this session.